All right, today we have another episode from the archives with one of my incredible guests. Enjoy. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, a show about the incredible people dedicated to helping those who have experienced trauma. My name is Guy McPherson, and my mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to inspire each of us to help those around us. All right, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. This is the podcast where we interview master trauma therapists from all over the world to learn about what inspires them and the steps they've taken to become masters in their field. If you're a trauma therapist or if you're interested in trauma therapy, this is it. Today, I'm so excited to introduce my guest, Dr. David Grand. David, are you ready to go?
I'm right here.
All right. So Dr. Grand is a licensed clinical social worker with a PhD from International University. He's a writer, lecturer, performance coach, and humanitarian, famous for the discovery and development of the internationally acclaimed brain spotting method. Dr. Norman Doidge, author of The Brain That Changes Itself, says this of our guest. David Grand is one of the most important and effective psychological trauma therapists now practicing, and his development of brain spotting is a very important leap forward in helping people resolve trauma. All right, David. So just giving our listeners just a little bit about you. Take a moment. Give us something personal about yourself. We want to get to know you, and then we'll head on over to the topic of trauma and what's going on with you.
Okay. Well, I'm a combination of different factors, and in the trauma field, sometimes we say parts, and parts can be having to do with our woundedness, but parts also have to do with our different sides of ourselves that are non-wounded and that are even healthy and very alive. And I'm a regular person. When I do therapy with people, they're not sitting there with somebody with a shrink mentality or attitude. I'm just there as a regular person. But at the same time, I'm sort of half scientist and half artist. And the scientist in me is always looking to understand on a fact-based basis, what's going on, where things are coming from. And the main fact basis I use is the brain and the body and neurobiology. The artist side, for me, I happen to be a writer and a playwright, and I work a lot with actors and singers. But for me, while I'm doing my work and even while I'm developing new theories, it's also very much a creative process. So my scientist and my artist sort of work together to help people to heal in my office, and also help me to develop brain spotting and to continue developing brain spotting.
Awesome. That's awesome. It's really exciting to hear, too, that the artist and the scientist coming together, and I'm excited to kind of delve deeper into that. I know you've got a lot of resources, a lot of kind of roles, if you will, that you're really interested in. But let's kind of transition and get to our next topic, which is a quote. This podcast is really about getting to know master trauma therapists with the goal of inspiring other clinicians. In order to do that, we want to get to know you, find out what's inspired you, share with us a quote or a mantra, something that's inspired you or guided you throughout your journey, your professional or personal career.
Well, most recently, the quote is, "It's all brain stuff." In other words, everything that goes on has to do with the brain. And back when I was trained in the 70s and 80s, we didn't really think brain. We thought the mind. But now I think brain all the time. But the other quote is, "You don't have to know what it is to know that it is." In other words, just because you don't understand something or don't know where it's coming from doesn't mean you can't work with it. And that goes back to it's all brain stuff also, because the brain is so complex as to be infinite and to be infinitely mysterious to us. So what I've really learned, in my decades of practice and developing practice further, is that most of what we think is going on is not really going on because we don't have access to it, or we don't have direct access, but that doesn't mean that we can't work with it. So that's that second quote. You don't have to know what it is to know that it is.
Okay. So let me ask you to break that down just a little more. And how has that kind of resonated with you personally? Obviously, we're making the listeners are making the jump right away to brain spotting because you mentioned the brain, but get more specific with us. You don't have to know what it is to know that it is. How has that kind of impacted you specifically?
Well, I have a good memory, and I remember what it was like for me to be a graduate student and to be a learning or a psychotherapist in training. And, in supervision, I'd ask my supervisors, well, what is it that we do? And how do we know what to do? And way back then, this was in the mid-'70s, and into the late '70s, they gave most of them, the wise ones, gave me answers that really didn't satisfy me at the time, which is that you really you don't have to know everything. In fact, there's a lot that you don't know and can't know, but that doesn't mean that you can't sit with a person and listen to them and be open to them and to receive them and to attune to them. And so that it's not just the information, it's not just the knowing, but it's the being, the state of being. And that if you provide the person you're working with really a witnessing, mindful, compassionate presence, that will provide more healing than anything else. That will give the people you work with something that they likely have never had before, and certainly not with that purity and consistency. So in that sense, you don't have to know what it is to know that it is. It's there in the person. And if you know it's there, a lot of things you literally, just by being with the person, will start to either come out or work themselves out inside of the person in a way that you never even find out what it is or, that it was going on. There's a term that we use in brain spotting and a lot of other therapies called processing. And processing is really a focused form of mindfulness. And literally, it is sort of the expression of the deeper subcortical or deep brain processes of just information moving down the neural pathways. But it's really so out of access to us consciously, thinking-wise. But it doesn't mean that it's not accessible to us in a deeper way. And that's what the presence gets to.
Okay. I love the way you kind of broke that down. And again, we keep hearing, David, this theme, if you will, of, yes, obviously knowledge and skills and education are important, but beyond that, or even the foundation of that, is the ability to sit, to witness, use that word, and to have that presence to listen to the person who's sitting before us. That is so powerful, right? Uh-huh. That is so powerful. And how did you develop that? How did you develop that?
I'm not quite sure.
I mean, is that something that just comes?
To some degree.
Yeah.
I was influenced by others. I've had the benefit of mentorship throughout my career, and some mentors have been, really more involved with me, and some were just very brief contacts with people here and there where I just took something special away from it. But it's interesting that I've never really studied mindfulness. I've never studied Buddhism or Hinduism or Zen. But what I've ended up discovering in my own healing journey, and which is helping others to heal and healing myself, is just this sense of presence. And if it sounds a little bit spiritual, I have no hesitation to sort of go there, because we kind of know that there's more than just than we know, and it kind of goes back to my quote. But it sort of found me more than I found it, and it's hard to articulate it beyond that. But basically, everything is always in process. Nothing stays the same. Everything's moving. When we look at a river, we can see that very obviously. But if you look at a mountain, you can't see that it's moving, and it just looks like it's there, and it's been there forever, and it will be there forever. But if you go to the Rocky Mountains, there are plenty of places where you can find fossils and shells and so on that tell us that it was at the bottom of an ocean or a vast sea. And I believe it's called the Bonneville Sea, that hundreds of millions of years ago, the West, before the uplift, was covered with water. And then it slowly came up because everything in physics and nature and life is always changing. Nothing stays the same. So I guess if you really are open to things, and if you're really observing and curious and even fascinated, you'll find that things are changing all the time, and you'll find that whatever you think is can't really be what it is because you're learning more and discovering more in your journey as a person and as a healing therapist, all the way through. I mean, I've been doing this work. I just passed my 38th year as a therapist. So a lot of it is just really life and experience and wisdom, but being open and being curious.
Right. I mean, beautifully said. And I mean, I just hear the breadth of experience, of compassion in your voice. And it just seems to me that you bring that wealth of presence and fascination and curiosity to the work you do. And I'm sure our listeners are picking that up as well. Awesome. Let's move on to our next topic, which is, and I'm really excited to get into this with you specifically, is specialization of trauma, how you got here. This podcast is about highlighting your journey, to become a master therapist in this field. People get into this field, the specialization of trauma, for a variety of reasons. For me, again, had to do with my brother being in the special forces, returning from war with PTSD, and me not knowing what to do, so excited to talk to him, engage him, and him not wanting to deal with it at all, and really me screwing it up, pressuring him to do it. Tell us a story, David. Break it down for us. What got you into this specialization, this field?
Okay. Well, it's not a one-part story, but my original training after graduate school was psychoanalysis, and it was a full analytic institute, and I was in analytic supervision and my own analysis. And it's analysis, although there are pluses and minuses to it, and there's a lot of critique about it, holds a great deal of wealth of wisdom to it. Freud in his journeys actually discovered trauma. I mean, he wasn't the only discoverer. You go back to Janet and other great forerunners. He discovered trauma, and he went into it. And at a certain point, he started to back off from it and go away from actual trauma to fantasized trauma. But it was still there in my original trauma studies. But I'll be honest with you, going back to the 70s and 80s, there was very little traumatology around, very little coursework. You could go through graduate school and even postgraduate training and never take a course in trauma. But what happened actually is in the early 90s, I studied EMDR. And EMDR, again, which is a very powerful and effective technique in other ways, in some ways, but in other ways has certain problems at the same time. When I brought it back to my practice and I started using it, I started to see not only amazing healing happen, but I started to see some amazing decompensation or destabilization happen. And what I discovered from this is that there were a lot of my clients who were much more traumatized than I knew, which was a real eye-opener for me. I even had a couple of clients who really went into crises that lasted 6 months and needed tremendous amount of extra help during that time. And beyond just, having trauma revealed to me, just the deepest kind of trauma and the traumas that lead to people having more dissociative kind of symptoms. It was sort of a baptism by fire for me, and this was really, I was already 15 to 18 years into my career. But with that, it was right in front of my eyes, and it became sink or swim, and I had to figure out what to do. And I, of course, got supervision and went for training and did a lot of reading. But that really started my journey as a traumatologist, which was seeing trauma emerge that I didn't know was there, and see trauma heal that I didn't know could heal, and see trauma come out that needed a lot of time and healing and help.
So what specifically about seeing trauma emerge and seeing trauma heal kind of lured you into it? Was it just, what about trauma? Why?
Well, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, why trauma?
Well, once you become a traumatologist, you start to understand the ubiquity of trauma as part of the human experience. And trauma starting pre-verbally in the first few years of life. For me now, I couldn't be a therapist without knowing about trauma and knowing what it is and when it starts and how it's just part of the human journey, as well as how it imprints certain people even more than others who have more severe traumas, more repeated traumas, especially in the context of abuse during childhood. But it really kind of revealed to me a lot of things that I intuitively knew before, but then now I started to informationally learn. And I started to hear and see and feel certain things I hadn't before. And of course, that leads for any person who is sensitive and introspective, it looks for you to look within yourself and to find your own trauma history beyond what you knew it was. So it's the ubiquitous nature of it in the human experience, and it is the compelling nature of it in the client experience right in front of us. Mm-hmm. And there's no client I see now who doesn't have trauma in any way affecting them. I work a lot with athletes, and I'm working with a college catcher now who lost the ability to throw the ball back to the pitcher. But it turns out that 3 years ago he was stabbed in the stomach by another teenager in a stupid random kind of event, and no one ever looked back to that trauma to see that might have something to do with him having trouble throwing the ball. But for me, it was fascinating, but it was also the opportunity to give this kid his talent back and give him in some ways his life back. And I find that over and over and over again. I think the thing about trauma also is the fact that it is in the brain, it's in the body, and that in the past it was really seen as something that was almost untreatable. And the notion that if somebody had seen something horrific in front of their eyes, that they'd have to live with that image the rest of their lives was something that was pretty much commonly believed, when in truth it doesn't have to be that way. And there are times when we can intervene with it, technically as well as humanly, and actually dramatically reduce those kind of trauma symptoms. Mm-hmm. So
go ahead. I'm sorry.
So it's just so compelling.
Yeah, I like what you said. I mean, the ubiquity of trauma and the compelling nature of it, and witnessing that, in the office with clients, and that beginning to affect you and impact you and make you feel, essentially. So well said. Thank you for that. So let's focus on an early clinical error and what you learned from it. How we learn from failure obviously is crucial. Tell us a story, David, about an early clinical error you made that's had a significant impact on you and the work you've done and what you learned from it.
Well, and this goes back to my early EMDR days. There was a client who I had worked with her for about 3 years, and she was making good incremental progress. And I knew she had a trauma history, but when I did EMDR with her, literally what I discovered is that she had bipolar disorder. And the EMDR, again, being so powerful and so incisive, actually kicked her into first a manic state and then a horrific depressive state. And literally this became a severe management issue for me and with her in my practice for 6 months before I could really help her get her feet back on the ground. So the mistake in this case was at least twofold. Number one was not diagnosing her properly, and I'm a pretty good diagnostician, and I guess I missed the clues of that. But then secondarily, because I hadn't diagnosed her properly, to apply a power therapy to her that really just absolutely overwhelmed her defenses. If I had diagnosed her correctly, I would have been much more judicious about how I applied the EMDR. I might not have used it at all. But here's the unusual thing about this. After those 6 months, which was horrific for her, and it was pretty horrific for me. And I mean, this was being on the phone every night, and her becoming suicidal, and just totally overwhelmed. Once she got past that, she actually was way ahead of where she was when she went into it, and actually made some major life changes that she hadn't been able to make in the 3 years of therapy with me. Now, I don't recommend, the course of treatment for that outcome by any means, but the lesson in this is that sometimes, you can make a serious mistake or series of mistakes, and that somehow through hanging in there with the person all the way through, there can be a positive outcome as well.
So, thank you so much for sharing that. The last part of what you said was really interesting to me. Sometimes you can make a serious mistake, and yet, the client can maybe benefit from that in a sense. Was that? Well, let's bring it back first of all to you said you didn't diagnose properly. Mm-hmm. What happened there? Was that just from inexperience? Was it difficult to make the diagnosis, obviously, or what do you think the error was there?
I think when we make an error, it's never because of one factor. I think it's a confluence of different factors. I have to admit that I was not as good at diagnosing bipolar as I was other conditions. I didn't have enough experience with it. That would be probably the primary thing.
Right.
But secondarily, she had a concurrent dissociative disorder. So the nature of her dissociative defenses were such that they were pretty, comprehensive and powerful. So I actually didn't even diagnose the dissociative aspect of it either. Had I done that, I might have had a better shot at looking at what was, beyond those tremendous walls of defense. But another thing is, you never hit 100%.
Right.
So say in baseball, we have to be diagnostically a lot more accurate than this. But in baseball, if you hit 300, which means you're out 7 out of 10 times for 15 years, they put you in the Hall of Fame.
Right. Yeah.
But as therapists, another aspect of this is you really can't, and I want the young therapists to really take this in. You cannot accurately diagnose every person right away just from the symptom cluster and the history and all the DSM-5 kind of stuff. It's helpful and valuable, but a lot of times what you think is the true diagnosis changes during the course of treatment. A, because a deeper truth comes out that you couldn't have access to right away, or B, actually because the diagnosis changes during the course of treatment, which is what happens during effective treatment. But in looking back on it, on the one hand, I could say, well, I missed certain things, but on the other hand, I could say there are certain things that I really just couldn't pick up at that time. They really didn't show themselves, and that happens to us at all levels, but it happens to us certainly earlier in our careers when we have less exposure to all the diagnostic stuff that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And what's coming up for me, David, is the complexity, the complex nature of the work we're doing here. I think a lot of clinicians, there are so many new therapies out there, EMDR and whatever, that there's this thought, that, well, if we just learn that, that will be the answer. And I think what you've shared with us is, how challenging this work can be and how attuned and aware we have to be to our own presence, right? It kind of continually comes back to that, and taking the time to sit with our client and not think that we know everything right away.
Yeah.
But
well, I want to say master therapists not only have a lot of experience, but are usually trained in many different techniques. And a therapist who is trained just in one technique and doesn't know any other technique really have a hard time becoming a master therapist, no matter how long they worked for.
Right.
Because the human brain has 1 quadrillion connections. That's 1 billion multiplied by 1 million. Okay, how can one technique cover all of that? And that's why we have over 1,000 different therapy techniques, and some are better than others. But the reason we have so many different ones is because the human brain, the human body, and the human experience is so infinitely complex.
Awesome. Awesome news. Awesome information for, I think, all of our listeners to take home. So let's move on. We get to one of my favorite questions. We talked about the challenges of the specialization. For me, I believe it's also important to know why we're doing something. The answer to that kind of drives us along in what we're doing day to day in our work. And this is a little different from the question about what led you here, but what's your why, David? Why are you in this field of trauma therapy? What keeps you going day to day? Again, tell us a story. Break it down for us.
Well, the why for me is because I see miracles in front of me every day. And I see things happen that are not supposed to happen. And I have clients come to me who've been to other therapists, sometimes many therapists, sometimes for long periods of time, and that I'm able, with my experience and with the tools I have from the technique that I've developed, to see change happen right in front of my eyes. One of the issues we have as trauma therapists is the vicarious or secondary exposure to the trauma, and that does affect us. And people will say to me, well, how can you handle hearing all that stuff, client after client, day after day? And my answer is because I'm able to see healing in front of my eyes. And that is the counterbalance for me for the traumatic exposure. But I will say to get specific about the why, first of all, we know things about trauma and healing trauma that we didn't know 10 years ago, let alone 30 years ago. But the technical things that are available and are still being developed, what we have now, 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to be way beyond where we are right now. It's growing and developing all the time. For me, as someone who's developed a method and who also teaches that method around the world, it's really important that I still have a private practice and I'm still doing the work, all the time. And occasionally people in trainings will ask me, well, do you still work with clients? And I say, actually, when I go back to New York, I'm going to go back to my practice. So that's my proving ground, and that's also my healing ground. But when people come to me who have been suffering for 5 months or 5 years or 40 years, and literally can see change happening during a session, the person who walks out at the end of the session is not the same person who walks into the session. I mean, that's compelling. That's amazing, and that provides my why.
Yeah, I think that is awesome, David. I'm just listening to you. There's just a groundedness in your tone, in your words, and I just think it's awesome, and I'm sure our listeners are picking up on that as well. You said, I see miracles in front of me every day, and I'm able to see healing in front of my eyes, and that acts as a counterbalance to, the potential vicarious trauma that's there. That is so powerful. I just want to thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, another quote popped into my head that I say to my clients all the time when they sit down, I say, let's get to work.
Let's get to work.
Okay, and specifically when I say that to my clients, this is not in a first session, but after they've been working with me for a while, they know that when they sit down, we're going to get to work right away, and we're going to max out that session from beginning to end and all the way through. So, we now can do that kind of work instead of the more open kind of endless talk therapy that, has value and is helpful, but you can't really focus in and say, let's get to work.
All right. So many of our listeners, are just getting into trauma therapy. There are others with more experience. David, obviously you've been honing your skills for a while. What advice would you give those of us, those clinicians out there who are maybe just getting into this field, who are interested in trauma therapy? What would you say?
I have 2 3-word quotes. The first one is, don't be afraid. The second one is, hang in there.
Don't be afraid and hang in there, okay?
Yeah, because, and I remember the first time I was working with a client early in my career who had dissociative identity disorder, DID, and she all of a sudden went into a part in front of me, and all of a sudden I was with somebody totally different. It's like, that'll freak you out. A novice therapist, and the biggest issue for the novice therapist was, well, what do I do? I got to do something. What do I do? I don't know what to do. But that's where don't be afraid and hang in there is. Just you be with the person, you go with them. If a person has a powerful abreaction and gets completely overwhelmed and gets dissociative, again, the feeling is, well, a therapist who hasn't been there before, young or a novice therapist, is the idea, well, they're gone and they'll never come back. But the fact is if you stay with them, if you hang in there with them, if you ground them just by your presence and by your words, sooner or later they do come back, and you'll see actually that whatever you were so afraid of happening doesn't happen. So the first few times, again, when clients went into altered states in front of me, or when clients went into overwhelming, dissociative abreactions, I didn't know what the outcome was going to be because I didn't have that experience, no matter what anybody told me. But I hung in there, and I faced my fear, and I got past my fear, and I saw that I was able to help to bring them back, and I was able to figure out what to do, and whatever I was so afraid of didn't happen.
So don't be afraid and hang in there. Obviously, there's so much behind those 3-word quotes, but very powerful, I think, for any level therapist. So, David, what I want to do before I ask you about 2 books that have influenced you, and for our listeners, everything we're talking about here is going to be available on David's show notes page at westcoasttraumaproject.com. Hit on the podcast tab, and David's page will come right up. I want you to kind of give us the summarized version of brain spotting. I mean, you've got so much going on. We're going to have a link to your website and everything, your books, etc. But, how does one go about developing something such as brain spotting?
Well, you have to be completely open. You have to be not only curious, but fascinated with what's going on in front of you. And you have to really observe. You have to observe very closely. And observing closely is multitasking, because you're observing the client physiologically, and brain spotting, it's the eyes and the face and the whole body. But at the same time, observing their process, observing what they talk about and where it starts and where it goes to. And with brain spotting, it really was that something just kind of happened that was unexpected. I was doing slow eye movements, and then I hit one spot that just all of a sudden kind of exploded out in a very good way. And I stopped the eye movements, and I held my finger right at the spot where that powerful response was. And so, I mean, the first thing was, when it happened, I could have kept on moving my finger. I could have kept on doing eye movements, figuring, well, that's what you're supposed to do. But when something totally out of the ordinary happened, totally surprising happened to me, I was willing not only to notice it, but to kind of go with it. And by doing that and just holding my finger there and having the client stare right at my finger right on that spot, she was able to, in 10 minutes, go on a journey I've never seen before that, and I've only seen rarely since then. But from there, then it was a matter of being able to think scientifically, which is to say, okay, was this a single event, or was this something that's generalizable to other people? And then you have to start to explore that, and really to look for these other manifestations and try to repeat what happened and see what happens there. For me, because I had been in the field at that point for I would say 28 years, 27 years, I had a lot of experience and I had a lot of exposure, and I'd learned not only EMDR, I learned somatic experiencing on top of psychoanalysis and other techniques as well. So the question that hit me was really a scientific question, which is this a new paradigm, or is this just another version of an existing paradigm? And I tested it out, with client after client, and then taught it to some other therapists, or showed it to some other therapists, and they tried it out too. So we started to see the universality of this response and this way of accessing deep into the client's brain and body.
Wow. So we're going to link up to your book, Brain Spotting, in the show notes page. And thanks so much for taking the time to do that. So can you recommend 2 go-to books for our listeners which have had a major impact on the work you do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to give 2 books, but before that, I'm going to go back to my analytic days. Freud was the father of modern psychology, and there is a vast amount of information in his writings. His collected works are, I think there's 21 volumes. It's amazing. The most challenging of his works, and I think that the most valuable of his works, is the interpretation of dreams. And I'd say that's worthy to be read, whether or not you are a psychoanalyst or whether you're even interested in psychoanalysis, because there's a treasure trove of information there. And that's not a quick, easy read. You got to really work your way through that. But coming up to some more, modern day books, most of my reading is in books that have to do with the brain, and Robert Scare's book, The Trauma Spectrum, which really looks at trauma from a neurobiological point of view, and sees a lot of physical conditions like whiplash and other things, and shows how it's directly linked to early traumatic experiences that a person has had, whether they get over whiplash or not, and whether they get a very bad case of it or not. I mean, this is sort of the link into it, but there's, because we not only work with emotions, we work with, body experience for a client. This book provides a great linkage with that. So it's, The Trauma Spectrum by Scare, Scaer. And another one, which is a breakthrough book, is by Norman Deutsch. You quoted him at the beginning. But the Brain That Changes Itself, this is like one of the masterworks on neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity meaning the brain's capacity to change itself and to change throughout life, which we used to think was not possible. But what he does in this book, he recounts, at least 12 or 14 different people who had profound issues that were neurologically based, whether it was psychological or physical, that were able to, through the right kind of treatment, and not just psychotherapeutic treatments, but sometimes physiological treatments, to literally overcome certain things, certain conditions, certain symptoms that are not possible to be overcome, or at least were thought that way. So what his book, Deutsch's book reveals is the kind of changes that are possible for people, which gives us a lot of information about the brain and about neuroplasticity, but also gives us a lot of information about the potential for change that goes beyond our expectations.
Okay, so we've got Freud's interpretation of dreams, Robert Scare's The Trauma Spectrum, And finally, Norman Doidge's Brain That Changes Itself, The Brain That Changes Itself. David, we're going to be providing links to all of these at your show notes page at westcoasttraumaproject.com. I'll have your book linked up there. I know you have DVDs. We're going to link up to those. You know, before we close out, I want to say earlier on in the interview, you kind of drew upon a metaphor, the mountain and the river. And as you've been talking, that has kind of kept coming up for me in the words you've used, in your presence, the way you speak. There's just this strong confidence that, comes through. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's been awesome, and I'm sure our listeners have really appreciated it as well. Thanks again, and we will speak soon.
Thank you, Guy.